Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, dubious speculation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Link is in the description below. The prices will be going up after the halving, so make sure to lock in the lower rate between now and then. We have a website full of thousands of charts for different cryptocurrencies. And I also put out 3 videos a week on the premium side. So a lot of stuff going on over there. Make sure you guys check that out. Links in the description below. Let's go ahead and jump in. So lots happening in the Cryptoverse right now. I've talked a lot about sort of the mechanics behind different ways in which the Cryptoverse operates. And so in this video, what I'd like to do is revisit a lot of those things and kind of talk about like where we are and what we might see going into the summer if things play out like they have in the past. And it's only the halving is coming up really soon. I mean, I'm recording this video Wednesday night. The halving's only a couple days away. By the time you see this video, it might only be a day away. So certainly a lot. That's an exciting event in the Cryptoverse, but I'm more so in this video focused on what just do the charts say, what's going on with the charts. So let's go ahead and jump in with things like the bull market support band, the 8-week SMA. One of the interesting things to note about the 8-week SMA is that there is this exception right here where we sort of got a fake out below it. And we talked about it, how, if you just get right back above it without really any follow through the following week, then it is just a fake out. And that happens just like you had a fake out right here above the bull market support band. It does sometimes happen. It doesn't mean the general view is not worthwhile to follow of following the 8-week SMA. It's just that sometimes you do get those very brief fake outs. One of the things that I've mentioned many, many times is that falling below the 8-week SMA would be a significant milestone. And this drop here at this point does seem somewhat significant. Be that as it may, I don't know what's going to happen going into the halving. I imagine the bulls would try their hardest to get it back above the 8-week SMA. But the 8-week SMA is all the way back up at 67K. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it is quite a bit higher than where we currently are. Now, let's go through a scenario where we close the week below the 8-week moving average. And I just want to go back and look at what previously happened after these manic rallies that lasted for a long time. What happened after we got that first close below the 8-week SMA? And we're going to look at 3 examples. We're going to look at 2019. We're going to look at 2021, early 2021, and we're going to look at the second peak in 2021. Okay, so in 2021, the first peak of 2021, what you'll notice, and by the way, there definitely are similarities, right, between this rally here and this one over here. Notably, we really got kicked off right here in October of 2020, and it sort of rallied out until March and April, right? We had a March peak and then an April peak, which was slightly higher. This rally also really got going in October after sort of it built out a base, right? I mean, you can kind of see the same thing, how Bitcoin built out a base here and then went into its mania mode starting in October, with it topping out ultimately in April. Kind of the same thing, right? I mean, it sort of built out its base again, and then this move really got started in October with a potential local top at least in March so far. So what's interesting is if you zoom in to this trend, it actually does look somewhat familiar. Right here, you can see that we had a couple of red weeks. We had a couple of red weeks right here, really small red weeks, just like that one. Then we had a couple of small green weeks that took us right back up, kind of the same thing. And then you had another wick up. Now, the main difference this time, though, is that in 2020 and 2021, in that rally, what we ultimately saw happen was that the first peak actually occurred in March was a lower high than the actual top in April of a higher high. In this case, at least what we've seen so far is that the local top in March has actually exceeded so far the top that we have seen in April. But you'll note there's two pretty clear wicks there, just like there were right here. And ever since then, Bitcoin has been coming back down. Now, what you will notice though is that after the first weekly close below the 8-week moving average, Bitcoin then actually had a relief rally back above its 8-week moving average, right? It had a relief rally back above it. And I know that oftentimes you will see Bitcoin find local tops in April. We saw a local top in April of 2021 and in April of 2013. Even in 2023, we had a local top in April before just sweeping the highs in June. So April does tend to be a significant month, but also, I talked a lot about how there is this other idea about how going into the merge, ETH actually topped out 1 month before the merge, before getting a fairly substantial pullback, right? If you look closely here, the merge was in September, which was here, which actually was in fact a lower high, And so I do think that's a relevant way to think about the market as well. But going into this move here, that first weekly close below the 8-week SMA, we then got a 2-week relief rally following it. Now, not all of these trends are going to be the same. There's some where that doesn't happen, and we're going to go through each one. So in the first one, though, you will note that there is a low here and then a higher low. We ultimately saw Bitcoin bottom out, a local bottom between this low in March and the low in February, right? So you can see we went below that low, but we stayed above the one from March. Now, if you go to today, you will see something at least so far is similar, right? There's this low here in March that we have gone below, but we yet haven't gone below we haven't gone below this low, at least not yet, that occurred a little bit before that. So I would say watch that, especially going into the weekend. Do we take out that low? Do we not? If we don't take out that low, and we are still, we get a weekly close below the 8-week SMA, then look to see if it does get that sort of a bounce. If it does, what happens? And this is the question. I've seen a lot of people debating this on X, and on of course on YouTube, and a lot of people are assuming, right? They're assuming that in such a bounce that Bitcoin dominant, they think that they would say that Bitcoin dominance would go down, right? In such a bounce, there's speculation, some of them, is that Bitcoin dominance would go down, right? I mean, basically everyone on Crypto X has been calling the top on Bitcoin dominance for the last 2.5 years. So why should this time be any different? But they're essentially saying that if it does bounce here, that Bitcoin dominance will go down. Now, I'm actually going to show you there is at least some evidence to support that potential view, but it's not my base case, in fact. Now, you might say, why? Because if you look in 2021, you will notice that that is exactly where the ETH tsunami occurred. Do you guys remember the ETH tsunami? Right? It was when ETH basically goes up about 2x in 2 weeks, and it occurred on a dead cat bounce by Bitcoin. Do you see what happened with ETH Bitcoin during that time? It skyrocketed. So you might say, Ben, if that were to happen, why wouldn't ETH Bitcoin do the same thing? Well, again, I am glad you asked, and I think there is a relevant way to look at the market that would dispute that view. The first way, which is a bit hand wavy, and I'm not asking you to take it to the bank, is that leading into that move, ETH Bitcoin was in an uptrend, right? So it was sort of putting in higher lows and higher highs, and also the Fed was expanding their balance sheet, right? So we know that when the Fed expands their balance sheet, we see ETH Bitcoin go up. When the Fed reduces their balance sheet, we see ETH Bitcoin go down, okay? So pretty clear. So then beyond that, let's suppose, other than just saying, well, it was going up over here, therefore it was going to keep going up. It's going down over here, therefore it's going to keep going down. Other than the momentum argument, what could we look towards? Okay. And this is where, when you look very closely at 2019, you should find the answer that you are looking for. And that answer lies within a very similar bounce after going below the 8-week SMA. Now, look very closely at Bitcoin in 2019. A lot of people refuse to compare Bitcoin in 2024 to 2019 because they say this is the halving year. That was a pre-halving year. So why should we make the comparison? The reason why we should make the comparison is because 2019 was a pivot year for the Federal Reserve, and I suspect that 2024 will also be a pivot year. For a long time, there's been a lot of debate as to whether monetary policy actually affects crypto in the same way it does traditional markets, and I've obviously been on the side that it does. There's been a lot of people that say that it doesn't, and that's why they thought that Bitcoin dominance was going to top out last year, because in 2019 it topped out in the pre-halving year, right? In the last cycle, it topped out in the pre-halving year. So they assumed that it would do that. And if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, if you go over to, say, a year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin dominance, right? We worked it in, right? If you go over and look at a year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin dominance without stablecoins, and you look at 2024, you will see that if you compare it to 2016, it basically just went down. 2012, there weren't any other coins, but 2020, it basically just went down, right? 2024, it's just been staying mostly up, and it hasn't really seen that large of a move to the downside. And I think that is a lot, and that's evidence right there that shows you that monetary policy is having an effect. In the prior cycle, we were already back to QE, and so Bitcoin dominance was going down, but we're still in quantitative tightening right now. So the answer to the question of why wouldn't ETH Bitcoin see a durable rally upon a potential sort of relief rally back up to the 8-week SMA, if it were to even come, which there's no guarantee, and we're going to get to a third example in a minute, is 2019. Now, you see what happened in 2021, right? The first weekly close below the 8-week SMA, we got this relief rally, and ETH Bitcoin shot up quite a lot, right? We know that, and I just showed it a second ago, but I'll pull it back up. ETH Bitcoin, will overlay it on the screen. You can see pretty clearly during that move, if I make these different colors here, but during that move, we saw ETH Bitcoin go up. So why should this time be different? Well, if you look at 2019 and you look at the exact same pattern, what you will notice is that it played out very similar to 2021, in fact. It's just that the nature of what happened to the rest of the market was completely different. Look at 2019. We also had a weekly close below the 8-week SMA the week of July 22nd, right? You see it pretty clearly right there, right? The week of July 22nd, a weekly close below the 8-week SMA. In fact, that weekly close below the 8-week SMA occurred exactly 4 weeks later after the local top, right? Exactly 4 weeks later. If you go look at it over here from this local top, it might be a little bit further out. But you can see it's been 5 weeks later, potentially, if we in fact get that weekly close below the 8-week SMA. Now, what you'll notice is that just like 2021, Bitcoin had a relief rally following its first weekly close below the 8-week SMA. But in that case, you did not see ETH Bitcoin go up. Instead, you saw it continue to go down, right? It continued to go down on that relief rally. Why did it continue to go down? Well, first of all, it was already trending down into that area, right? So momentum continued to carry it down. But also, you can see that the Fed was still reducing the size of their balance sheet. And therefore, while in 2021, the relief rally that came actually in May, right? I mean, it actually occurred it really materialized late April going into early May. Kind of a very similar setup if you think about it, right? Late April going into early May, you can see that it went back up to the 8-week SMA and ETH Bitcoin fell. But the Fed was expanding the size of their balance sheet during that time. Today, it's different in the sense that the Fed is reducing the size of the balance sheet. And so I think it's more tenable to compare it to what happened over here in 2019, where we got a similar type of move where ETH Bitcoin actually dropped. Okay, so that is why I think that is more likely that ETH Bitcoin drops under such a circumstance than it actually goes up. Now, there's no guarantee you even get a relief rally next week. There's really no guarantee that even happens at all. And, for evidence for that, you'd have to actually look no further than 2021 itself. but at the second top, right? So in the second top, after we fell below the 8-week SMA, that first weekly close below it, right? Rather than getting a relief rally the following week, Bitcoin just capitulated down, okay, in the week of November 29th, right? So it just capitulated down. But I want to show you something on a lower time frame with ETH Bitcoin, because when I overlay it here, you can only see a little bit of it. Look at the ETH Bitcoin chart. Okay, now look at Bitcoin USD and let's figure out what week this was where Bitcoin got the weekly close below the 8-week SMA in 2019. It was the week of July 22nd. Now look at ETH Bitcoin, the week of July 22nd. Where was it? It was right here. This was the week of July 22nd. So it had just followed the breakdown of ETH Bitcoin. Delayed by 1 week, actually. Delayed by 1 week. So it's 1 week off here. But the week that Bitcoin had its first weekly close below the 8-week SMA, ETH Bitcoin was actually a green candle. And it occurred 2 weeks after ETH Bitcoin broke down. What happened the following week when Bitcoin got the relief rally back above the 8-week SMA? The week of July 29th and the week of August 5th. You will see very clearly the week of July 29th and August 5th, ETH Bitcoin dropped 8.5% and then it dropped 7.5%. Now, there could be some form of diminishing volatility to the downside. If you look at when ETH Bitcoin has previously broken down, you can see that in the first instance, it actually dropped quite a lot from the range low. It went down about 40-something%, like 47, maybe even a little bit more. It went down around 50% or so. Whereas in this drop over here, it only dropped around 33%. So it wasn't as big of a drop. So perhaps if Bitcoin were to see some type of move like that, you could see ETH Bitcoin drop, but, getting, as it's now below the range low, which is exactly what happened right there, that first move down after that was about a 20% drop. That still wasn't the bottom, but it was a 20% drop. Even if you get from here next week, even if you get, say, a 10% drop, that puts ETH Bitcoin at 0.043, which coincidentally corresponds to this top here. So my base case is that if we were to get some type of relief bounce into back up to the 8-week SMA sometime in the next couple of weeks, next few weeks or so, then I would actually assume that ETH Bitcoin continues to break down just like it did over here. That would be my base assumption. Because we know where we are in the cycle based on monetary policy. That is my base assumption. Now, there is something that theoretically challenges that. Now, but before we get to that, I will say that there's no guarantee, right? If you're over here thinking, that means there's some type of relief rally that's going to come save your altcoin bags, that might not actually be true. Because even if there is a relief rally by Bitcoin, that does not guarantee a commensurate relief rally for whatever altcoin that you hold. Do you know over here when Bitcoin had that move back to the 8-week SMA, do you see that move 15% the week of July 29th, 5% the week of August 5th? Pretty nice move, right? 15% followed by 5%. What did ETH USD do? Right? What did ETH USD do those 2 weeks? Nothing. I mean, basically nothing. The week of July 29th, it went up 5%. So during a week where Bitcoin went up 15%, ETH went up 5%. And then the following week, when Bitcoin went up another 5%, ETH was negative. It dropped. It dropped 3%. So that was what caused the devaluation of the ETH Bitcoin pair. It was the fact that Bitcoin was bouncing around and it was just chopping the altcoin market up because there's a stronger bid for Bitcoin because the altcoin market just keeps on bleeding back to it. So you can see pretty clearly that that's what happened, right? Bitcoin occasionally got relief bounces, but it ate the altcoin market up during that time. And I think the same thing is happening now. I think that Bitcoin is it's chopping around this range up here the same way it did in 2019. The same way, right? It's chopping around this range. And every single week that we get any type of continued chop, what's happening? ETH Bitcoin continues to slowly grind down. Bitcoin dominance continues to slowly grind up. What will likely mark the top for Bitcoin dominance? Well, it'll probably correspond sometime after the first rate cut, and it could correspond back to quantitative easing. Now, what's interesting is if you look at Bitcoin USD, Bitcoin dominance topped before Bitcoin fell below the bull market support band. If you overlay Bitcoin dominance onto this chart, you will see that it actually topped right here in September, and then we fell below the bull market support band. Bitcoin did just a couple of weeks later. Now, I think something similar could happen again. Bitcoin dominance could actually top before Bitcoin USD goes below the 20-week SMA. There's a good chance that could happen if this were to repeat itself. But what needs to happen between now and then would be that Bitcoin just kind of chops around for a while, and every time it gets those moves back up, it breaks alts down even more. Remember, during high rates and quantitative tightening, Bitcoin rallies break the altcoin market down. There is no guarantee that it has to be on a Bitcoin rally. There are examples where alt Bitcoin pairs break down on Bitcoin dumps, and you should have realized that this past week when Bitcoin dropped and altcoins dropped a lot more, right? We've seen it before. It happened. It also happened back over here in May of 2022. You can see that Bitcoin dropped, and during that time, ETH Bitcoin, right, as Bitcoin dropped, ETH Bitcoin initially went up, or sorry, no, so this is Bitcoin dominance. As this dropped, Bitcoin dominance went up. Right? And then you can see it didn't top here until Bitcoin hit a local bottom. So there's no guarantee you even get a relief rally back to the 8-week SMA if we end up following what happened over here in late 2021. So I think it would be foolish to try to take that to the bank. There's no guarantee. Furthermore, even if you do get a relief rally, it doesn't mean it has to start next week. We already showed that it's off by a week when you look at ETH Bitcoin. So maybe we just kind of sit humdrum for a week and nothing happens. But imagine what that would be like if sometime after the halving, everyone is thinking, oh, that's it. Everything's over. Woe is me. And then right as everyone gets up or gives up, there's some type of relief. And then everyone's like, oh, see, I told you so. And then it ends up just resolving into a lower high in May, right? And maybe it resolves into a lower high in May because the unemployment rate in May comes in super hot. Or maybe the inflation rate comes in super hot. I don't know. But that could be something to sort of keep in mind. I do think there's a lot of evidence supporting a potential summer lull. And I want to talk a little bit about that. I will say, before I get too much further into this, guys, I could be wrong, right? I mean, sometimes I get things wrong. I'm not asking you to take these views to the bank. I'm just doing the best I can. Sometimes I'm right. Sometimes I'm wrong. Come up with a strategy, not based on what I'm saying, please. This is just my view on the market. And again, if you're looking for someone that's going to be 100% right about something, if you find them, don't tell anyone about them, right? I mean, keep them to yourselves. But these are just my views, and they may play out, they may not. So from here, I mentioned earlier that, there's some evidence to suggest that, that there could be still some left. It is, sort of like a period where Bitcoin dominance still kind of wanes for a little bit. And maybe the best evidence for that is to go look at the dominance excluding stablecoins. You look at the dominance excluding stablecoins in 2019, you'll see a very similar pattern, right? A series of lower highs and lower lows before we ultimately went up and swept the highs. Same thing over here, right? Lower highs and lower lows, and we've gone on up, and then we swept the highs. We talked about this many, many times, so that's likely what's going to happen. And everyone was like, no, it's a halving year. You don't know what you're talking about. And here we are. We put on a new high. We actually saw Bitcoin dominance go to 57%, which means that everyone who spent the last 2.5 years calling the top on Bitcoin dominance was once again wrong. So we swept the high. Look what happened last time we swept the high. Dominance excluding stables. We did see dominance pull back a little bit before then going back up. And it actually pulled back in June, right? In June. Now, this move here, though, was a lot more substantial, right? It actually went well above the high before getting a pullback. These moves over here by dominance were a lot more substantial as well. So if you do see a pullback here by Bitcoin dominance, which you've actually already seen, I mean, you can see it's already pulled back a little bit. I don't think it would be as big as this one, because this trend over here is sort of like a miniature version of this one, right? It's sort of like a miniature version of it. And I've tried to think, like, what would cause, what could potentially continue to cause something like that? And, again, it could be just sort of the devaluation of Bitcoin, where Bitcoin kind of keeps going down a little bit, and the altcoin market is sort of holding, because last week the altcoin market took a huge hit, and so there's sort of some recovery going on over there. I don't know if that would be the reason or not, but my base case is to not really not really care at all about that, because who cares, right? I mean, more than likely in 2 months, the dominance is going to be much higher than where it is today, okay? I don't know if it's going to go back below 55% between now and then. Frankly, I don't care. I spent the last 2.5 years dealing with trolls on Twitter telling me on every single Bitcoin dominance dump why I was wrong. And again, it just keeps on going higher. So I wouldn't worry too much if there is a pullback in Bitcoin dominance. I do think that it's going to go much higher into the summer, at which point I think you could make a case that ETH Bitcoin could maybe bottom out this summer, right? I'm thinking June at the earliest is my guess, but again, I'm subject to change that opinion. I don't really have like a super strong opinion on it. I just think if it were to play out like prior cycles, we saw that both prior cycles, when ETH Bitcoin broke down, it took about 8 weeks for it to bottom. So if it took about 8 weeks again, you can see there was 8 weeks, here was about 8 weeks or so. If it were to take 8 weeks, that would essentially put it in early to mid-June, which, by the way, is exactly when it bottomed out in 2022. So maybe this time is not different and it just bottoms out in the summer. I'm thinking June, maybe July. It kind of depends on what ETH Bitcoin does after the halving. The reason I say that is because, after the spot ETF, ETH Bitcoin had this relief bounce. And it made a lot of people sort of FOMO back in, right? Because it had this relief bounce. But I said it's probably just going to be a lower high, and it was. And I even said this is probably going to be a lower high, and it was. And I was sort of just looking at the 2019 comparison, a high and a lower high, right? It was kind of the same thing in the sense that you have this low, you bounce off the low, you put in a high, you put in a lower high, and then you go back down to low again. And we're kind of seeing that here, right here, where you have your first low, and then your second low, and then your second low, right? And then you even had a third low before it got another bounce, right? The main difference, though, is here it's already broken support. Here it actually didn't. So I don't really know that it has to get this bounce. If it does, I would expect it to get rejected at the bull market support band on weekly closes, just like you got rejected over there. That would currently correspond to about 0.053 to 0.054. Again, not really my base case. It has already technically broken support. And if you look at the trend over here in 2016, you can see that after it came back down, it didn't really bounce much at all. It just kind of kept on going down. So base case is that ETH Bitcoin continues to bleed. Base case is that Bitcoin dominance continues to go up. It's not a monotonic. It's not monotonic, right? It's a stochastic process. So please be aware of that. I just think, whatever happens the next week or two is kind of not that important. It's more important what we think about in terms of going into the summer. So, that is kind of where I am right now. As far as Bitcoin USD and sort of going back to the 8-week SMA, I do imagine that if you don't go back to the 8-week SMA and you just kind of get a larger drop like that, that might cause the dominance to stall out for a little bit. But if you do get a relief rally, kind of like what we saw in 2019, back to the 8-week SMA, or even if it's like early 2021, back to the 8-week SMA, I still think that is where the Bitcoin dominance would go up a lot. And if that were to play out, then my guess is that you're just going to chop around up here for a little while until the dominance is around 60%. And then once the dominance of Bitcoin hits 60%, then Bitcoin USD falls below its bull market support band, just like it did over there. You might say, why 60%? That's also a valid question. There's a lot of different reasons why I think 60%. The fluffiest one, which is not something I put a lot of weight into, and actually I came up with 60% before even seeing this, but if you look at the breakdown of Bitcoin dominance over here in the prior cycle from 2017 to over here, you can see it rallied back up to the 0.618. And if you take the breakdown from right here, the 618 would actually put you at 60%. The other way that I think you can look at it is if you look at the Bitcoin dominance excluding stables onto TradingView, there's a wedge pattern here. And the top of the wedge, if it were to sort of continue, would put it, at around 64%. If we just say, what about where would it be by June? You can see it'll be about 63% or so. That's currently, that's April. If we go to June, about 64%. Now it's currently 59%. So that's another 5% move. Well, coincidentally, the Bitcoin dominance is at 55%. So if it moves up 5%, that gets you to 60%. So I do think that dominance excluding stables is likely going to go back up to the top of this wedge, at which point it might be the top. Okay. Another way that you can look at it is to actually add in USDT dominance to the Bitcoin dominance, and you will see that it also swept the high just like it did over here in 2019, right? So you can see that it had a high, it swept the high, it had one last pullback, and then it just went up. So we had a high, we swept the high. It looks kind of like we're in our pullback right now because the dominance excluded, or the dominance of Bitcoin plus the dominance of USDT, it went all the way up to around 62%, and now it's back down to 60%. So, I mean, it kind of looks like we're in this pullback right here. But again, my guess is that it's ultimately going to find a bottom and go much higher as we get into the summer. Okay, so again, if you're looking for a reason for why any of these altcoins might bounce against Bitcoin, I would look towards something like that. But it kind of looks like we've already had a lot of the move down, and altcoins are still not. I mean, Bitcoin dominance is still holding above 55%. So I don't, I mean, it might stall out here for a little bit, but I do think it will continue to break through. There's a lot of other things that are kind of interesting when you look at Bitcoin USD that could give you some evidence of a potential local top for a little while. One of which is if you take the Fib retracement tool from 2017 peak and just sort of take that to the peak today, you can see it actually topped out right at the 4.236. If you're like, well, this is great, it's only hindsight, because I did a video like during the week where I pointed this out, and I pointed it out because I found it interesting, not necessarily to say that it has to be here, but that back in 2021, Bitcoin only rallied back up to the 3.618, right? So here it rallied up to the 3.618, and then it swept the high again. It didn't make it to the 4.236. Now it has made it to the 4.236. But you want to know what's actually fascinating about this is if you look at total market cap, and you look at that same retracement tool, you can see that in 2021, it made it to the 4.236 when Bitcoin didn't. And what's even more fascinating is that now total only made it to the 3.618. How crazy is that, right? So in 2021, Bitcoin was weaker than the altcoin market. It only made it to the 3.618. But in 2024, Bitcoin is stronger than the altcoin market as it went to the 4.236, whereas total has only gone to the 3.618. What's different between here and here? What's different between 2021 and 2024? Monetary policy has changed a lot. Look at Bitcoin dominance. Where was Bitcoin dominance over here? It was at like 40%. And I said back in late 2021, early 2022 that Bitcoin dominance is entering a macro uptrend, and it's likely going to go to 60%. And look at this. Look what happened. 3 years later, almost exactly 3 years later, after at least this top here, 3 years later, Bitcoin is at the same price, and the dominance is up from 40% to 55%. Right? So I think, this would be some evidence, right? It's at least some evidence to suggest a summer lull. It doesn't have to happen. Even last summer, I said that we could get a summer lull, and I would still argue that it was a summer lull. A lot of you guys might not remember it as such, but when you think about it, when we talked about a summer lull in, I believe, April, it bled until June. And then it literally got a 1 week pump for the most part, and then it just bled again until September. So, to me, that is a summer lull, right? Not a lot happened. The market was relatively boring. I think the market could very well be boring this summer as well. So that's, some more evidence of it. The main thing that I go back to is, there's three things, and we've talked about a lot of them. We've talked about them forever. So unless you're new here, you should already know what I'm going to say. We know that in 2019, there was two things that marked the top, that marked the transition from risk on to risk off. One was the breakdown of ETH Bitcoin. And again, it was one of the sources of liquidity, and it got taken away to some degree as ETH Bitcoin broke down. And when ETH Bitcoin broke down, it marked a local top by Bitcoin. So here you're looking at a very similar thing where ETH Bitcoin is breaking down, and it potentially marked a local top for Bitcoin. It's not just ETH Bitcoin though. It's also gold. If you look at gold, if you overlay gold onto this chart, you will see basically the same thing. When did Bitcoin go from risk on to risk off back in 2019? It was actually exactly when gold broke out, right? You see gold right here, it broke about above these prior highs. That marked the top for Bitcoin. And when did gold break out? It didn't break out in April. It actually broke out in March. Precisely, basically, when Bitcoin is put in its local top, which also is about a month before the halving, which is when ETH topped out about a month before the merge. Now, of course, ETH continued to go higher later on, but it had a period where it cooled off quite a lot going into the next few months. So that's more evidence. And then, of course, the other one that we've talked about is USDT dominance. If you look at USDT dominance, take a look at this trend line. I've been pointing it out forever as well. I did a whole video on USDT dominance back over here. And I said, look, there's a good chance it's going to go from 6% down to 4%. And it did. And it was accompanied by a continued Bitcoin rally. But the issue is that with USDT dominance is that every time it has hit this trend line, it has marked a larger pullback in the market. It marked a larger pullback starting in December 2017, even in November 2018. It was just before Bitcoin dropped quite a bit. June 2019 was the mid-cycle top back in the last cycle, right before rate cuts began. February 2020, I shouldn't explain that one. March 2021, November 2021, March 2024. And we hit this trend line again. Now, where you might get potentially thrown off is in March of 2021, we hit this trend line, and we kind of kept tagging it throughout April and even into May. So if you were to get some type of relief bounce, you could actually see us go tag that trend line again. But every single time we've tagged this trend line, we had to see sort of a reallocation of capital for a while where people took profits. There was a lull in the market. And then after kind of consolidating there for a while, we saw USDT dominance start to go back up. And there's actually a similar trend, right? If you look at the bull market support band, you'll see a lot of times there's this move where you sort of go down, you go back up, get rejected by the 20-week, and then you go back down to it. Right here, you go down, you go back up, get rejected by the 20-week SMA, and then you go down to it. Same thing. Go down, go back up, get rejected by the 20-week SMA, and then you go back down to the trend line. So we've seen this happen many, many times. Now, the next question you might have is why are you only looking at USDT dominance? Why not look at USDC dominance as well? It's a fair question, and so we'll just add it in. And you can see that if you add that in, it gives you basically the same thing. I mean, it's kind of a rounding error. I mean, qualitatively, it's the same thing. So I think maybe this is the area to look at right here because it is now at the bull market support band. So, I mean, it depends on if it breaks through or not. If you get a relief rally back up to the 8-week SMA, then it would be a rejection off this in the short term. If you don't get a relief rally back up to the 8-week SMA and it just plays out like late November 2021, and you say go straight back down to the bull market support band or something, then the USDT dominance just sort of breaks through. So a lot of things to consider. And by the way, in this entire bull market, all these pullbacks have only been about 20 to 22% pullbacks, right? So 20% pullback, 20% pullback, right? All of these have been 20% pullbacks. And so, there's going to be some people, right, that are going to think that it's just going to be another 20% pullback, which means that, if you do see it at 58K, 59K, I'm sure people are going to bid it up because that's what they've been doing. And they could be right? I mean, maybe that's what leads to a relief rally in the market. But note that when ETH Bitcoin broke down in 2019, it finally led to a larger drop in the market to the tune of 30%. And really, the market had dropped before that relief rally occurred, had dropped around 34%, which was much more significant than any of the other drops that had currently seen, about 18%. 14%. So, I mean, what happens if it plays out like late 2021, where you don't really get a relief rally and it just goes back down to the bull market support band? I mean, if you get something like that, a 26% drop gets you back to the bull market support band, right? The problem is that normally when you go this long without testing it, you could argue that we're too far gone to hold it as support, and therefore you get a summer lull, right? You get this period where it just sort of goes back below it. It happened there. It also happened back over here. And you can see here it took 24 weeks to get to back to the below the 20-week estimate. Here it took 32 weeks. We are currently on week 26. So we are in between this one and this one. I've said before, I think this move here is a combination of this one and this one, because 2019 was during quantitative tightening and high rates. The secondary move over here was during QE. We put in a new all-time high, though. So just kind of like over here, we put in a new all-time high. So a lot of different things, right, you can look at to sort of look at this move. And the reason why I still remain very pessimistic about alt Bitcoin pairs is because if you look at 2019, during this period right here, that's where alt Bitcoin pairs mostly put in their bottoms. It was when Bitcoin kind of chopped around for a little bit during this phase. And so if it does something like that, then I think alt Bitcoin pairs might bottom out somewhere in that range, right? Somewhere in that zone as Bitcoin just continues to chop the altcoin market up for a few months. I think that's where you might actually see altcoins bottom against Bitcoin, at least the ones that are going to, and Bitcoin dominance top out. But I think we're too early in this trend for that to be the case just yet. I think that that Bitcoin's going to continue to chop the altcoin market up for probably at least another month or two before that is the case. And I do think there's a lot of evidence to support that, as I've been talking about quite extensively in this video. If you look at individual altcoins, they really mimic that 2019 move a lot more than they would the 2020 move. I mean, there's a lot of great examples of that. If you look just at Ethereum, if you just look at ETH, and I did a whole video on this previously, but you kind of have this wedge here, and it looks like it's playing out in a very similar fashion, right? Where you have this wedge, you break above it, and then after ETH Bitcoin breaks down, ETH USD falls back through the wedge. So ETH Bitcoin broke down right here. After it broke down, ETH USD fell through the wedge. ETH Bitcoin just broke down here, and now it looks like ETH USD is potentially falling into the wedge. It doesn't mean you can't get a relief rally and a lower high, but I do think there's a case to be made that it's going to go back into that wedge. And if you look at other altcoins that are even riskier, you have things like ADA. And if you look at this one, I mean, this move does look very similar, at least at this point, to this one right here, right? I mean, if you look closely, I mean, it almost looks like a carbon copy of this sort of this double peak move right here. If you just sort of overlay it, you can see it. I mean, it looks really, really similar. And when ADA USD was falling right there, it also happened to correspond to when ADA Bitcoin was breaking support, right? ADA Bitcoin broke support right there, which is when ADA USD capitulated back down to the range low right here. If you look at it over here, you can see that ADA Bitcoin broke support right here, which is precisely when ADA USD capitulated back to the range low right there. So it's all very similar, right? It's all very similar. The main difference this time is that rate cuts are occurring basically a year later than they occurred in the prior cycle. It doesn't mean that it's not playing out. It just is taking a long time for us to see the whole thing play out. But it's there, right? I mean, it is there if you look for it. I do feel like you can see it playing out. And the reality is that the altcoin reckoning was always based on alt Bitcoin valuations. And if ETH Bitcoin is putting in new lows, which it is, and if ADA Bitcoin is putting in new lows, which it is, this is a trend line that everyone said was going to hold. My loudest critics in the Cardano community told me that I was clueless for saying that ADA Bitcoin would go below 800 sats because they said this trend line was going to hold. And I said many, many times, it's not going to hold. And it's nothing against them. It's nothing against Cardano. It's just monetary policy, right? I mean, don't take it up with me. Go take it up with Jerome Powell. It's just monetary policy. And you can see that it has fallen below it, and it's probably going to go to 400 sats. Dot Bitcoin is putting in new lows, right? And the reality, Matic Bitcoin, putting in new lows. The reality, if all these altcoins are putting in new lows, and the altcoin reckoning was about the devaluation of altcoins against Bitcoin, then it means the altcoin reckoning is not over if all these alts are putting in new lows. So that's where we are, right? And You know, the tough lesson I learned last cycle was that if alt Bitcoin pairs can put in new lows, alt USD pairs can put in new lows. I saw that happen with many altcoins last cycle. So don't tell me it can't happen. It can. I saw it happen last cycle. If you have a problem with that, just go look at what happened last cycle with a lot of altcoins. Bitcoin has the luxury. It is so much higher up than the altcoin market, right? I mean, it could drop, right? It could drop from here, could drop 65% and be at 25K, which is still well above the prior low, right? What happens if ETH drops 65%? It's still going to be above the prior low, but you're not that much further above it, right? I mean, you're at $1,400, right? Which would actually look very similar to this one right here, where ETH USD fell back to slightly above this higher low, right? So you had a low and then a higher low. Here you have a low and then a higher low, right? I mean, it would get you sort of close to that range, where it found this low a little bit higher than that, right? Right around $1,400, right? So kind of looks really similar, right? It kind of looks really similar. But the issue is that in the altcoin market, you can't say the same, because if something like ADA were to drop 65% from these highs, it's back down to the lows. And the issue for ADA is that it's bleeding on its Bitcoin pair. So if Bitcoin were to drop 65%, then ADA is probably down 80%. So that's how altcoins can put in new lows after, once rate cuts arrive, or even, because they're already not even that far off their lows. So if you get a more substantial correction on Bitcoin, whether it's 65%, whether it's 57%, or whether it's a more minor correction, alts can put in new lows because they're not that far off their lows to begin with. If you were to look at like Matic, I mean, is it really that far off its low? I mean, it would only be a 55% drop just to get it back to its low. There's just so many things that you can look at that show very clearly why the altcoin market has been so risky compared to Bitcoin. It doesn't mean that some haven't outperformed. I said that 2 years ago. I said it 2.5 years ago that some alts will outperform Bitcoin, even though Bitcoin dominance is going to go up. And that's exactly what happened. And every single day, I have messages from people saying, you said not to buy alts, and this altcoin outperformed Bitcoin. They would have been. Yeah, some microcap meme coin can go, yeah, sure, it can outperform Bitcoin. Most of the coins from last cycle are still putting in lower highs against Bitcoin. That's the fact. That's the fact. So I stand by it. I mean, I stand by it. It was not wrong to be bullish on Bitcoin dominance. It was not wrong to be bearish on ETH Bitcoin. It wasn't wrong to be bearish on ADA Bitcoin or any of these altcoins against Bitcoin for the most part. The ones that people point to are they're cherry picking the low because most of them are still putting in lower highs against Bitcoin. And the ones that are not, for the most part, are new altcoins that don't have the baggage from the prior cycle, which, by the way, is what I said would happen, that the ones that are likely going to go up against Bitcoin are going to be your newer altcoins that don't have that baggage. Now that we look back on it after all this time, and you're looking at a $62,000 Bitcoin, and everyone is scared, it's only 62K. I mean, it could drop, even if it were to rally back up to the 8-week SMA, or even go above it, it could drop all the way back down here, and it's still doing pretty well, all things considered. Imagine, if you bought Bitcoin in late 2022, which, by the way, on ITC Premium, I said I was doing, despite what anyone wants to say, the receipts are there. Even if it were to drop back to 42K, you're still up 164%. Now, the people that bought it up here would be pissed off because they're down 44%, but you're still doing well. The issue is that was there ever a time where it would have been made more sense being in a collective basket of altcoins over Bitcoin in that case? And I would say no, because if Bitcoin were to drop back down here, let's say 58%, where's total 3? Where would total 3 be? 58% puts you back at the lows, right? It just simply puts you back at the lows. That's the issue for the altcoin market, is that Bitcoin has the luxury of getting a larger pullback and still being pretty, up a lot. The altcoin market doesn't have that same luxury, and that's how altcoins can put in new lows. You might say, well, this time is different. Guys, we saw the altcoin market put in new lows in the halving year last cycle. Now, it was induced by a pandemic, but at the end of the day, it was a recession. And you can't tell me there's no risk of that. I'm not saying it has to happen. You could have a soft landing, but we've had an inverted yield curve for an extremely long period of time, and it could theoretically happen. The unemployment rate is curling up. In fact, if you go look at the unemployment rate, anytime it goes above the bull market support band for the most part, I mean, it's just it just keeps on going up, right? And we're above it. I mean, look at all these times I have them highlighted. So it could happen. It doesn't have to be induced by a pandemic, but maybe it's just induced by, 2.5 years of tighter and tighter monetary policy. So that's how it could theoretically happen. And I saw it happen last cycle, and I don't care what the excuse was. At the end of the day, you're always going to come up with a reason, right? Why? It doesn't matter if it was caused by a pandemic. All that mattered was that I DCA'd into altcoins throughout this entire phase, and I would have just been better off with Bitcoin. That was the reality of the situation. I can blame it on whatever the hell I want to blame it on, but the reality was that I could have just been stuck with Bitcoin, and I would have been much better off. There was never a time where it made sense to be in the collective altcoin market over Bitcoin, basically throughout this entire phase. But then once QE came back and the last rate cut arrived, then you bet your sweet you-know-what it made sense to be bullish on the ETH Bitcoin valuation, which I was. And actually, I turned bullish on the ETH Bitcoin valuation at 0.02 in 2019, which is where it ultimately carved out a bottom. But that's why I say, it's really not that complicated. If you're bullish on Bitcoin dominance 3 of the 4 years in the cycle, you're probably doing something right. Altcoins really only durably rally against Bitcoin for like 1 year of the cycle. Look at Bitcoin dominance. Really, look at Bitcoin dominance, and you look to see when these alt seasons occur where Bitcoin dominance is crashing. It really only lasts about a year, and then we spend the next 3 years dreaming of alt season, right? It lasts for about a year, and then you spend the next 3 years dreaming of alt season. And then by the time that I convince the last of you that the Bitcoin dominance is likely going to 60%, that's when it finally tops out, when the last person capitulates their alts to Bitcoin. When the last person stops telling me that ETH is holding up well against Bitcoin. Because it's not, and it hasn't been. Then every time I say that it's going lower, I get trolls all over X telling me why I'm wrong, and they've been bullish on it for the last 2.5 years. It's easy to call the bottom on something over and over and over again, because eventually you will be right. And it's not cool to be bullish on Bitcoin dominance when most people here only care about altcoins. So what they do is they just keep on calling the bottom on it, on ETH Bitcoin, and they keep calling the top on Bitcoin dominance day after day after day. They laugh at anyone who disagrees with them, and then when Bitcoin dominance goes up, they call the top on it again. When ETH Bitcoin goes down, they call the bottom on it again. They'll eventually be right. My guess is they're going to be right when we go to 0.03 to 0.04. For ETH Bitcoin, my guess is they're going to be right when we go to 60% Bitcoin dominance. And that, I think, is ultimately where the top for Bitcoin dominance could be. One crazy thing about this is if you add in USDT dominance, you will see that we're not that far off of where we were back over here. Back over here when we broke the range high was at 64%. Here it's at like 62%. Ultimately, what happened after that is that, from here, it would rally up all the way up to 75%, right? Maybe it goes a little bit lower, 73%. This is both Bitcoin dominance and USDT dominance. But you can see, we could get there. If you were to look at Bitcoin dominance plus ETH dominance, look at this. It's an oscillator because it doesn't matter how many tens of thousands of meme coins you print. There's no more money coming into them. The money's just being diverted from one meme coin to 10,000. So dominance isn't going to go down just because you print another 10,000 meme coins. It just means that each meme coin is going to become a little less relevant because there's so many more of them. So blue chip dominance is an oscillator where it goes basically between 58, 57%, up to around 79, 80%. And right now it's around 72%. I think it's going to go all the way up here to around 80%, meaning another 8% move by Bitcoin plus ETH dominance. That's my guess, about another 8% move or so. It doesn't have to be quite that high. I could see a case where you have slightly lower highs, But I still think it's gonna go. It's gonna make a run here. So that would be something to look at as well. And again, if you look at like alt Bitcoin pairs, I'm not really sure if it's gonna see any more relief from here or not. If they do, my guess is they get rejected off of the bull market support band, right? So you can see right here, they had this relief move back up before getting rejected and going down off the bull market support band. You could argue we already had that move, although it did go above the 20-week SMA, so I'm not really that sure. Again, if it were to do something like this, it would correspond to the Bitcoin dominance plus USDT dominance sort of getting this pullback before going up, right? But again, this cycle we've seen things not as they haven't been as spectacular. In fact, if you were to get a bar pattern of this, it might actually be interesting to overlay this and you compress it, right? So if you kind of like compress it down, it would look something like that, right? I might need to even compress it a little bit more, but it would look something like that, where you're in the pullback right now, where maybe it goes down a little bit more, but then I think it just shoots up into the summer, And again, trying to think about what would cause it to go down. I do wonder if a larger pullback by Bitcoin would cause it to go down. But I mean, even that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense because this is also USDT dominant. So if Bitcoin goes down, then USDT dominance is theoretically going up. So it could be theoretically a Bitcoin bounce where altcoins outperform. But again, that's not really my base case. And if they do outperform, I think it would be extremely short-lived because in 2019, during high interest rates and quantitative tightening on the relief rally, Bitcoin dominance went up, not down. So that's my base case, is that alt Bitcoin pairs break down, Bitcoin dominance breaks up into the summer months, potentially topping out in maybe June or July, maybe around the first rate cut. I don't know exactly, but this whole process has been taking a lot longer than I thought, so I'm not going to, say for sure when I think it's going to top out, but I do think it's ultimately going to go up a little bit more, probably up to, this is, Bitcoin dominance plus USDT dominance, probably up to, 74, 75% as a high. But I could see it not going that high. I mean, I could see it going only to like 70% or something. This is not just Bitcoin dominance. This is also USDT dominance, remember. So if you just look at USDT dominance, it's currently at, 5%. It was at 4% not that long ago. So, I mean, if it were to go back up to 8% or something, right? I mean, that's a 3% that you're adding on to Bitcoin dominance. Is 5%, that gets you 8%. And that can kind of get you there. So definitely a lot of things to think about. Bitcoin halving is coming up really soon. So if the bulls are going to get above the 8-week SMA this week, it's got to be because they bid it up into the halving. They haven't been able to do that so far. And so if they can't do it by the end of the week, and we do get that weekly close below the 8-week SMA, I think that next week is the key week to look at, because you either get this rally like early 2021 or or mid 2019 back to the 8-week, or you just don't get it and it just just capitulates again into a pretty large drop. And if it were to get something like that, then you would essentially find yourself back at the bull market support band at around 53, 54K or so. So that's what I'm essentially looking at right now. There's 1,000 different other things we could think about, and I mean, I could of course tie it into the long end of the yield curve, to the dollar. The dollar's in a rally. I said many times going into the summer, I think this is going to form a higher low and go higher into the summer. The reason that's an issue for alts is because as liquidity gets sort of taken out, as the dollar goes up, you get the devaluation of other currencies against the US dollar. The purchasing power goes down. Alts bleed to Bitcoin. High risk assets bleed to low risk assets. During this DXY rally over here, we saw the Bitcoin dominance go up a lot, and I'm guessing we're just going to see the same thing happen once again. So those are my views on Bitcoin right now. I suppose it's always worthwhile to look at other things, like, for instance, year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin in 2024 compared to, say, 2021 and 2017, and kind of see that. I mean, if you look at 29 or at 2021, since we were making that comparison, I mean, you can kind of see some similarities here. And so let's see if it gets that sort of a lower high in May or not. Because if it does get that, if it gets a lower high in May, then it might sort of make people think, all right, we are in fact getting a summer low. The biggest case to suggest that I'm wrong would be that if we are getting a left translated cycle, where we just kind of keep rallying on up into the summer. Again, it's not my base case. It really isn't, but there's a lot of people that are talking about it still. And who am I to say that it can't happen? If you take the ROI from the peak, measured it from April instead of November, you can see that we are kind of right where we were at this point last cycle. So I wouldn't completely dismiss that view. You might say, well, Ben, that goes against everything you just said. Guess what? I don't trade everything I just said. I've just been Bitcoin heavy for a long time. I converted my alts to Bitcoin in early 2022. I converted my ETH to Bitcoin in 2022 between mostly 0.07 to 0.08 and some a little above 0.08. And I bought Bitcoin at the lows with USD as published in ITC Premium. That's what I did. I sold a little bit of Bitcoin in 2024. That's what I did. I sold some Bitcoin in 2024, as I mentioned, but I didn't sell any in 2023. So how do you navigate it if you get a left translated top? Well, I mean, you have some Bitcoin, right? I mean, because guess what? No matter what happens, Bitcoin dominance goes up. It gives you exposure to the upside. It minimizes your downside risk. That's the view. That's been the view for like the last 2.5 years. It gives you exposure to the upside. It minimizes your downside risk. It doesn't mean that Bitcoin's not going to crash at some point. It probably will. In fact, if you go look at the days since the last time Bitcoin had a drop, since it had a 30% drop, I mean, it's been 526 days. I mean, come on, guys. It's going to drop 30% at some point. It's been a long time. It's probably going to happen. And when it does, everyone's going to act like they could have never seen it coming, you know. But it's been a long time since it happened. And I mean, it sort of seems like we're getting close to one. But again, that doesn't mean that it has to materialize immediately. You could see some relief here and there. I just think that no matter what happens going into the summer, the Bitcoin dominance goes up. Whether it means Bitcoin's going down or up, there's a good chance it's doing both, right? There's a good chance it's going up and down and sort of chopping around for a while. And the altcoins get eaten alive by Bitcoin. Because they can't catch a bid during such monetary policy. And there's so many of them that the money gets spread out. It's too thin. The order books are too thin. So when Bitcoin sells off, the altcoin market, because they broke down in their Bitcoin pairs during Bitcoin rallies, they have nowhere to hide when Bitcoin dumps. So you have to think about a lot of those different things as you navigate this market. For me, it has always been a Bitcoin heavy portfolio. Make sure you keep some cash in case, you know, something really bad happens, and or if it just plays out like 2019, where it sort of just finds a local top and we just sort of slowly trend down for a while, right? I think it's worthwhile to have some cash if that happens. And the way you can be hedged is, you could also have some Bitcoin in case I'm wrong, and I have some Bitcoin in case I'm wrong, right? I mean, I think a lot of people forget that, right? And I've said that for years, but I put out views about what I think. I have some Bitcoin in case I'm wrong, because, you know, if Bitcoin goes to 100K, I'm going to be sad I didn't have more, but at least I had some. But again, I'm going to express my views. Those are my views. ETH Bitcoin broke down. Gold broke out. The main thing that is providing me a little hesitation is that alt Bitcoin pairs still haven't technically broken down. And so I'm not really sure if that means there's still that more liquidity that Bitcoin can take from the altcoin market, but that is something to keep an eye on. They still haven't technically broken down. And so that still, I think, theoretically needs to happen. But anyways, we'll go ahead and wrap it up there. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up. And again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Prices are going to go up after the halving, so make sure you lock in the low rate. Links in the description below, in the pinned comment. See you guys next time. Bye.